stop there, okay? By the way, the other one of Diana Butler Bass's books, okay, which I should have mentioned, is a longer book, about 300 pages, and it's a great title, Christianity for the Rest of Us. And you get the drift right away from the title. And that book is organized, each chapter is organized around one of the practices that characterizes these congregations that are thriving. Okay?
Last night you put Isaiah 40 in a historical context in terms of a transition in history for the people of Israel, which I did appreciate. When I first went to seminary, one of the first things I learned was it is bad to take things out of context. Context is always important, and that was very important to me. But by the time that sunk in, I began to hear there is no context, particularly for the time of Jesus Christ. And I had one professor say that we know almost nothing about the time of Jesus. Some 50 years have passed, and there's a lot more that has been established about history in the time of Jesus. My question is, in terms of the historic Jesus of faith and the Christ of history, how might that have changed during that time frame?
How might that have changed over the last 50 years? Okay, yeah. Well, you're quite right that it was common to say 50 years ago that we know very little about the Jesus of history, perhaps can know very little about the Jesus of history, and besides that, the Jesus of history doesn't really matter. It's the Christ of faith, the Christ of the canonical Gospels that most matters. This was to a large extent the response of German theology to the work of Albert Schweitzer in the first decade of the 1900s. And it became widely affirmed in North America, too, amongst progressive or liberal mainline scholars. I think that really has changed over the last 30 to 35 years in particular. I think 30 years is probably even a better figure. Partly it's that we do know much more about the world of Jesus now than we did even 50 years ago. Some of that from manuscript discoveries, some of that from archaeology. A lot of it, though, from understanding data that we already had, but understanding it within a different framework, namely understanding it within the framework of what we know about the economic and political dynamics of ancient societies, and I'll be saying more about that in my third talk this afternoon. So we have, I think, a much better picture of the world of Jesus. And I also think that some of the historical skepticism that marked the quest for the historical Jesus during the first half of the 20th century has now been, I don't know if you want to say diminished or muted or transmuted. That's because a lot of the quest for the historical Jesus, until recently, was concerned with the question, how much of what matters to Christian theology, like Christological titles, Son of God, Lord, and so forth, understandings of Jesus' death as salvific and so forth, how much of that goes back to Jesus himself? The answer is very little. But once the question shifted from how much of Christian theology can be traced back to Jesus to the question, are there some things we can know about Jesus with some degree of probability without Christian theology shaping the questions? And then it became clear that we know far more about Jesus than we know about the historical Buddha or the historical Muhammad, for that matter, and that we maybe know as much about Jesus as we do about any figure from the ancient world. Now, maybe we know as much about Jesus as we do about Caesar Augustus. And so that's what has emerged. It's not a return to some kind of biblical inerrancy or whatever, but just if we let, there are steps here. If we let if we let historical questions rather than theological questions determine the agenda, then answers with reasonable degrees of probability, and the degrees of probability vary depending upon the question, are possible. It's kind of an abstract response, but I'll content myself with that. And of course, that's what my book, Jesus, is about. So if you want to know more, yeah, okay.
You said in your earlier lecture about us reclaiming the language of the Christian church, and in this lecture you talked about worship, reclaiming the hymns. What do you say to women? Because the language of the church, the language of the hymns, the liturgy, the prayer are so patriarchal that we can't see in them our female part. So what do you say to women who want to come back to the church, who want to participate in the church?
Yep. I think inclusive language is vitally important. And it's kind of amazing that it's taken us until 30 years ago or so to begin to see that. And anything that is freely composed by the church, by the congregation, meaning the sermon, the prayers, if they're freely composed, they must use inclusive language. Or you just want to say, where have you been, to whoever is not using inclusive language? Okay. Within a denomination that has a fixed prayer book, like my own Episcopal Church, it's unfortunate that the revision of our prayer book was done right before there was a general consensus about the importance of inclusive language. The prayer book was done in 1978, and that was the first new one for 50 years, so we don't do revisions very often. Then it's a bit more of a problem, though even within the Episcopal Church there are approved alternate liturgies approved by the national church that can be used. So, again, the problem is slightly different for denominations that have a fixed printed liturgy written in a prayer book, but even then you can do small things like opening, very near the opening of each Episcopal church service, there's the language of blessed be God and blessed be his kingdom forever and ever. In our church, we say blessed be God and blessed be God's kingdom. I mean, it's a small change, but it's easy to make. So, and then in terms of biblical readings, we still do not have a really fine inclusive language Bible. The new RSV, which came out in 1989, as I recall, moves to inclusive language for people, okay? But still uses masculine pronouns for God, which I think is really unfortunate. And I think there are ways of solving that are stylistically just fine and not awkward, you know. To speak about my own writing for a while, not to hold myself up as a paragon here. But I remember a review of my book, The God We Never Knew, which was published in 96 or 97, I can't remember now, but 96 or 97. And it was by a pair of feminist authors, the review was. And the review said, amongst other things, so they really liked the book. The review said, amongst other things, that they finished the book and couldn't recall that I had ever used non-inclusive language, but also hadn't noticed in reading the book that I was trying to avoid it. So no himself, herself, slash marks, and all of that kind of thing. So they reread it to see if I really had used inclusive language all the way through, and I had. And they used that book as an example of how inclusive language can be used without it becoming obtrusive or stylistically awkward. Now again, it sounds like I'm doing a little bragging here. That's not my point. My point is, it is possible to be consistent in the use of inclusive language without it constantly calling attention to itself. And my hunch is that most of you probably worship in congregations where maybe the only thing not in inclusive language would be masculine pronouns for God in the biblical readings. But I don't really know that. Okay. Seminarians for several decades now have been forced to use inclusive language. I was a visiting professor from 1989 to 1991 at Pacific School of Religion in part of the consortium in Berkeley. And the rules for faculty members were that if a student used non-inclusive language in a paper, we were not even to grade it, but to hand it back and insist that it be rewritten in inclusive language. It wasn't that the student got an F, but we simply would not grade or accept a paper. This was a rule of the seminary if it used non-inclusive language. So there has been a concern in probably most mainline seminaries for a couple decades about moving toward completely inclusive language. I think it matters, okay? See, we have time for one more if I'm brief. Yeah.
Dr. Borg, I'd like to ask what the Christian faith has to say to the people of Africa who are living in famine much of the time, unable to see the lilies of the field or for the birds to be fed by God.
Mm-hmm.
That I like what you said, but I think it leaves out the other half of that, which is what's the message from the Christian church to those folks?
Yeah. Okay, what's the message of the Christian faith, of the gospel, the Bible, whatever, to the people of Africa, using them, some of them, as an example of people whose lives are horrendously filled with suffering? Probably more than one thing. Some of those folks might find consolation in the message of an afterlife. And if they do, I'm not going to begrudge them whatever consolation that offers them. But I would not think that that should be the Christian message to them. The Christian message could include the following. It's not God's will that you suffer under these systems of oppression. Whether it's some, indigenous tyrant or group of tyrants, or whether it's the leftover effects of Western colonialism, it's not God's will that you suffer under these systems of oppression. And that in the midst of your suffering, God is with you. And in the midst of your suffering, try as best you can to center yourself in God. But don't see your suffering as anything other than something inflicted upon you by the powers that be. This is not God's will. God's will for you is very, very different. And you can say, well, what are you saying to them? Calling them to be political activists? No, not really. But I am suggesting that we not come up with a message of otherworldly or next-worldly consolation as a way of saying to them, oh, don't worry about your suffering all that much. There's a better world ahead. I think that's peddling snake oil. So, and then, of course, beyond that, the Christian message should be Christian deeds of humanitarian assistance. I'm speaking not just of charity here, but let me use the United States as an example. I'll go 2 minutes over. In general, Americans, I don't mean most of you now, but statistics show, in general, we Americans think of ourselves as a generous nation. Most Americans think we give away far more money in foreign aid than we do. By the way, do you know where we are on the list of the 15 industrialized nations in terms of percentage of gross domestic product given in foreign aid? 14th. Only Italy is behind us. We are a remarkably stingy country when it comes to genuine foreign aid. Now, if you include military assistance, then you know we rank pretty high, okay? And so part of it is for us not only to encourage more Christian humanitarian assistance to these countries, but to put pressure on our own government to behave differently internationally. In a way, the Christian message to Africa is to some extent a message to us. Many of you have heard about the Millennial Development Goals, that if each of the developed nations of the world would give, and I forget what it is, 0.75% of gross domestic product or 1%, that basically world poverty could be eliminated by the year 2015.